There was a report that MIT put out. This is 1971 or 72. And one of the things that that report outlined was that there are two fundamental drivers to the destabilization of climate. One of them certainly was increased emissions being generated by fossil fuels, but the other was this disruption of the water cycles in the living systems. The problem was that trying to model water cycles and land use across the entire planet was way beyond the computational capacities that we had in the 70s. And if you were going to start to talk to nations about how they were managing their lands, you're in very perilous political territory.
Welcome. I'm Dale Walkinen, and this is Facing Future. Our technological society has largely lost the deep understanding that our lives depend on nature. It is not simply a dollarable commodity or a geochemical machine. Its biodiverse systems are far more complex, and we threaten them and have threatened them at our peril. Today's guest, Brett Kenkarn, is the founding director of the Center for Regenerative Solutions and Senior Division Manager for Nature-Based Climate Solutions in the City of Boulder's Climate Initiatives team. Together with my co-host Herb Simmons, author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, we'll explore how we might reverse land degradation, habitat loss, and provide alternatives to the chemical paradigm. How can we widen our focus to encompass the immense possibilities of restoring at least a third of the 70% of land that has been degraded by human civilizations? Brett, we're so happy to welcome you today. Do you want to take a crack at that question?
Well, delighted to be with you. I deeply appreciate these places where these dialogues are taking place, and I'm always excited to have this kind of a conversation. Where would you like to start today, Dale?
Well, your work has been largely with land restoration, both locally in Boulder, and I understand as well other international efforts. We have restored land in the past. We had Francis Perkins once upon a time who restored things. Do we have a chance of having some sort of restoration in this country under this administration?
Yes. Well, it's taking place right now. I mean, I think we can get very caught up in the understandable malaise of this time for a whole bunch of different reasons. But that often overshadows the fact that there are people out there from backyards and neighborhoods to watersheds that are doing truly remarkable things. Where I like to start these kind of conversations, though, is to step back a little bit to look at what the narrative has been in our larger society about what our environmental priorities and urgencies are. And I think it would be fair to say that over the last 20 years in particular, our environmental awareness has been almost entirely swallowed by the climate issue. Even though when the modern environmental movement got started, which was 60s and 70s, and a lot of that was around things that were degrading the living world, especially pollution, pesticides, chemical exposures, etc. We were then very aware of what the living world around us was experiencing. But contrary to the sort of meme of don't look up the movie, in fact, we've been looking down. I would say we actually have been looking up almost entirely, and that we ought to be looking down again and saying, what's taking place right under our feet, right around us? And if we look at what's taking place around us, it's a pretty disorienting and disturbing scene. The reality is that human beings occupy something like almost 80% of the terrestrial surface of the planet. And the estimates vary, but that probably somewhere between a third to well over a half of that land area is deeply degraded. And in fact, I believe that you could make the argument that we're living on a planet that's operating at about half of the photosynthetic capability it had maybe just 100 years ago. And that's because of the way we practice agriculture. It's the way we've deforested our systems, the way we've degraded and mismanaged our riparian systems. That's a remarkable reduction in the energy cycling capabilities of this planet, which is basically where all life originates. I mean, everything that we value ultimately starts with some entity out there capturing sunlight, using that CO2, water, and carbon to create the things that now we are made of. So I think we've sort of lost touch with that. And that is, we've lost touch with that. And we, especially because the climate narrative has been so much about CO2 and about the technology that has produced CO2, namely our energy systems, this has become almost entirely this abstract conversation about things we can't even apprehend, greenhouse gases, and the technologies that we need to change, which of course fits very nicely into a sort of cultural and technological narrative that, it's always sort of technology that solves our problems and the technologies, all these opportunities. But in fact, what we really need to be doing is simply restoring or regenerating, in fact, the capacity of this living world to capture and cycle all these resources.
A lot of it has to do with water and what's happened with the water that used to be in the soil, because water vapor is the primary greenhouse gas. A lot of people don't realize that. So instead of the water being on the land, the water has moved up into the air. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that was exactly where I wanted to go next. Thank you. So one of the things that we haven't been noticing, because we haven't been looking down, is that, as you said, there's a vast amount of water that used to be cycling through the terrestrial living world that's now in the atmosphere. So we've been so preoccupied with how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, we've been missing the fact that we've been moving a whole bunch of water into the atmosphere. Part of that is just a physics principle. For every 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, just because of physics, 7% more moisture goes into the atmosphere. So it's hard to actually conceptualize the volume of this. It's actually about 3 inches of sea level that is actually now up into the atmosphere. It's one of the reasons why we have these inundation events, because there's so much more water coupled with so much more energy. Because, that's what's happened, is that the greenhouse gas layer has basically allowed more energy to be captured into our global system. And that, combined with all that extra moisture, creates these kinds of intense things. So because of this carbon focus, for the last 20 years or so, the whole conversation about the role of living systems has just been basically relegated to seeing the land as a carbon sink. And
yes.
So we've been entirely focused, we should be managing our lands to capture more carbon. We were a part of that wave. And so in the 2016-17 period, the city of Boulder is a unique community. We were one of the first communities in the country to tax itself back in the 60s so that we could buy open land before it became suburban development. And so we created this remarkably rich open space system that now comprises 40,000 acres that surrounds our community. So our city manages 40,000 acres. And so our open space department, which is a fantastic organization, lots of really amazing folks, came to us about 4 years ago and they said, hey, we know you're really concerned about this carbon thing. We manage 40,000 acres. So obviously we could be a big part of helping to balance the community's emissions. So we spent 2 years and a lot of money with some, very thoughtful and bright consultants trying to estimate how much carbon our 40,000 acres of forest, rangeland, and ag lands actually absorb on an annual basis. And what we found was that and to give you a point of reference, the city of Boulders as a community, the 100,000 or so of us here, we estimate something like 1.2 million tons of CO2 emissions each year. And so we thought, gosh, if there were like 400,000 or 500,000 tons that we could be cycling into our living systems, that'd be really amazing. And so we did the analysis, and what we came up with was that on a really good year that was wet, and because we live in the semi-arid West, right? that was wet and that was actually doing a lot of that kind of cycling, our landscapes, our 40,000 acres could absorb something like 20,000 tons of additional carbon. So that's 2 orders of magnitude smaller than our community's emissions. And then on a bad year, which we're having more and more of, where we have forest fires and other things, our 40,000 acres are a net carbon emitter. So this isn't to say that the management of our lands is not important to climate. It's to say that we've been focusing on the wrong thing, because what we've been trying to maximize is carbon sequestration. And in fact, what we now realize is that we should be maximizing water absorption. And so that is, I think, the new and emerging priority. In Colorado, the state has finally started to recognize that the largest single reservoir of water available to the state is not in surface water bodies, it's in the soil. But we don't have any sort of systems for tracking and monitoring and optimizing for that. We're starting to work on that. We're starting to develop these sensor networks and other things. So the point I'm getting at is we need to be a lot more focused on water because, as you said, water is the dominant greenhouse gas. It doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long, but it is the dominant greenhouse gas. And that's why the degradation of the living world and the liberation of all this water into the atmosphere has been a major driver of climate change that hasn't been recognized or really accounted for very effectively up to this point.
That's such an important point. And I'm wondering, I think I know the answer, but let me ask you, has the perspective that you've just clearly articulated, is it beginning to be reflected in what you hear at the annual COP meetings, the IPCC, the national climate plans, or is this still a kind of, for want of a better term, a fringe perspective, even though I think Dale would agree with me, this deserves to be front and center and not fringe?
Yeah, well, I do think actually a little bit of the history of this is really important because I think knowing how we got into the narrow confines of our current view versus where we could go. So, when the world was first starting to really, as a global community, acknowledge that this was happening, there was a report that MIT put out. This is 1971 or 72. And one of the things that report outlined was that there were 2 fundamental drivers. And in fact, this has been known for well over a century. There are 2 fundamental drivers to the destabilization of climate. One of them certainly was the increased emissions being generated by fossil fuels, but the other was this disruption of the water cycles and the living systems. So they in the report actually calls out that there were 2 legs, 2 drivers to climate change. Now, the problem was that trying to model water cycles and land use across the entire planet was way beyond the computational capacities that we had in the 70s. And the added dimension that if you were going to start to talk to nations about how they were managing their lands, you're in very perilous political territory. So it's my understanding that somewhere in the 70s, late 70s and 80s, and there's a report that came out in 79 by some really prominent MIT geoengineers who said, look, you can look at this through the carbon cycle. And so they came out, and that's where we started to say, well, we can model the carbon cycle and we can change the carbon cycle by changing technology. So if we just do that and we remove that driver, theoretically we'll deal with this climate change urgency and we'll have time to start working on the larger, land use change piece. Well, obviously, it didn't work out the way they had proposed, but it fit nicely into a world that really liked technological solutions and simple ideas. So it's like, okay, it's all about this simple carbon math. And so we were still not entirely locked into that. And then Bill McKibben cinched us in finally when he came out with the Rolling Stone article in 2012, which is something called The Terrifying Climate Math. And he just broke it down. It was just so simple and it was so straightforward. And also it was very conveniently very focused on the oil and gas industries or the energy industries, which of course was kind of like a long-standing battle that the environmental community was trying to find new forms of traction in. So it just sort of was this perfect storm of getting us into this very narrow box of understanding what climate change was and how we were going to deal with it. And that, again, turned us away from understanding that this was this much broader land degradation issue. The other thing that
350.org. I remember when he came out with that.
Yeah,
the number of particles of carbon in the air. That was his
by far,
thing.
The single most important publication was not a scientific journal. It was the Rolling Stone article.
Yeah, well, Rolling Stone has had a pretty significant cultural and now scientific impact. Sort of what you're saying is maybe a rough analogy is the idea of if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's essentially it's sort of we fit the reality into our preconceptions rather than the other way around. And changing that is remarkably difficult.
Yeah. And then, of course, it doesn't help that all of the moneyed interests really kind of like a technological solution because they can invest in that and they can leverage that. Even if they're invested in, conventional energy sources, they can invest in this other thing too. And so just fits that sort of technology centric way that we try to approach things. I want to ask
you, and you can come back to what you were going to say or include it in your answer. But what are some of the examples of sort of real life restoration efforts to give our viewers some sense of grounding, no pun intended, grounding this conversation a bit?
I mean, I think one of the things that was even disorienting for me as I was coming to these realizations was that imagining a technological shift seemed actually more accessible and possible than to think that we're going to somehow restore the planet, right? That seems like just overwhelmingly huge. But there are actually some really amazing examples of how, as humans, we have done this. And I think one of the most striking to me in history is how we address the unraveling of the Great Plains. It's really fascinating, and I think it's worth everyone doing this to go back and watch Ken Burns documentaries about the Dust Bowl. It is terrifying when you put yourself in the position of the people who were living through dust storms. It was like hell.
It was almost surreal. The dust. There's nowhere you can run. You can try to get out of it, but it's as if it follows you. You can't escape it.
It was an ecological catastrophe of biblical proportions, and it was happening across a vast area of the United States. And so when you step back from that, if you're 1935 or 36 and you were sitting there looking at the Great Plains, you think, it's over. This is it. I mean, nature wins. We're done. And yet what we had at that time was leadership that was very focused on the question of, I've got all of these displaced people who need useful, meaningful things to do. And we've got this crisis and catastrophe. Let's put those two things together. And through a lot of really amazing collaboration and work, we put millions, this is amazing, we put millions of people on the ground. We planted windbreaks and we created windrows and terracing systems and revegetation systems and nurseries, and just the scale of work that we initiated over just 10 years was enough to largely stop the worst aspects of it. And in 10 more years, we started to actually reverse that cycle across a land area that's about a third of the United States. So that, I mean, to me, was an example of like when we have the will and the collective resources of government, we can do amazing things.
My name is John D. Liu.
Other examples, like John Liu has done this beautiful documentary work of the Loess Plateau in China that has been degraded for thousands of years, that had reached such a state of degradation that people were just dying from starvation.
When I first came to the Loess Plateau, I was astounded by the degree of poverty and degradation. And I wondered, how could the Chinese people, the largest ethnic group on the planet, come from a place that was this barren?
And through the course of work with the World Bank and the Chinese government, over really, again, just 10 to 20 years, they reversed that degradation and created a landscape that could start supporting people again. And then if you even go now to the work that's going on in India, the natural farming movement in India is remarkable. When I was first learning about it, I thought it was amazing that they had 800,000 small farmers practicing organic, natural, non-input related farming. That's now 1.8 million farmers. It's over a third of the entire state of India in Andhra Pradesh. It's just amazing. So we can do this. It just means that we have to have that as the priority of society. And so I wanted to raise that kind of at large scale, but ultimately this work is always ultimately local, right? So the question then is, well, then what does it look like in the local context? So I could provide a number of examples of that from kind of the bioregional down to the very local. But I would say that's the kind of the starting point for me, is that it's possible. We just have to be oriented as a society to doing it.
Mm.
One of your ideas that we both picked up on was this idea of a regenerative economy, where instead of expecting people to sort of volunteer to water the trees or whatever it is, to actually create, like the WPA, a core of people who get paid, and jobs are created, and there's an economy that goes into this restoration process. We're going to lose a lot of jobs from AI. People are going to be out of work, and so it seems like, wow, this is a perfect opportunity to propose this. Maybe not under this administration, but maybe locally under different states. This could be happening.
Yeah, I'm going to walk into this by starting back in the 30s. I think about that time a lot. I mean, you had the roaring 20s, this kind of crazy, very sort of individualism-centric sort of society. Then the crash happens. You get Roosevelt in office. I mean, imagine walking into office like Roosevelt did, and like you have this system that's just completely coming unraveled, and you've got to figure out what to do. You're in big trouble in a crisis like that if you have no real experience and demonstrated approaches to draw on. But he did. When he was the governor of New York prior to being president, he had actually developed and piloted this whole idea of a forestry restoration program. And he had created forestry camps and that kind of whole model that became one of the first waves of the CCC work in the 30s. So he already had a lot of those systems in place. And I say this because I think it's really important. We might think, well, there's nothing we can do now. There's a whole bunch that we need to be doing now to develop and test and improve systems of restoration and regeneration locally. So I'd say this is not a time to wait for something later. We've got to be doing that now. But to your point of like, okay, then what do we do and how do we do it and how do we get more people involved in it? Well, let me, by the way, just step back and say, I want to clarify terms. I think that we are in a period of transition from a world in which the terms we use were things about sustainability. And then if we saw problems in the living world, we were going to do restoration. And I think we need to be living into a world where the primary terms are resilience, because sustainability was a myth. Let's face it. It was actually developed to try to sort of obfuscate the fact that the limits to growth had pointed out that we were going to be in this situation at some point, and here we are. So we need to be resilient now. It's a time of change. Resilience is about how you live with disruptive change and change into a new system. And we need to be in regeneration. It's not enough to restore things. We actually have to regenerate the capacity. In fact, I think one of the ways that we're thinking about or trying to start thinking about how to develop metrics of success for the regeneration work is around thinking about the net primary productivity of the living systems. So just think about a lawn, for example. A lawn has a certain set of inputs and outputs. You know, in terms of its outputs, like it covers the ground, that's good. Is it biodiverse? Not at all. I mean, especially if you've removed the clover and everything else, like hardly anything can live there, right?
The dandelions, all the good things that you could eat
exactly.
formerly.
Yeah. You know, it doesn't produce much shade. It doesn't have that kind of diversity. So that the net primary productivity of that site is, I'd say, like 30% of its capacity. Now imagine for those people who removed their lawns and introduced a lot more diverse species, which we did at our house. It is absolutely phenomenal to see all of the different forms of life that are taking up residence because we've created so much more space for them to do their thing in whatever way they do it. In fact, there's a lot of new gardeners in my yard, and they aren't us. There are the birds and the squirrels and the microbes who are all bringing their own new friends to the neighborhood, which is really cool. So, and what I'm saying is the net primary productivity of that site is far higher. And we could actually, I think, start to measure that in terms of things that are important to us: shade, water absorption, reducing invasive species, et cetera, but also in these other ways. So that's what we need to be doing. And we can do that at every scale, from the backyard to the bioregion. And in fact, we need to do it at every scale. And so, whereas in the old paradigm of climate action, where if you weren't buying an EV and putting solar panels on your house, you weren't really a player in the game. In this scenario of climate change, every party can be a part of that, because there's some part of the living world outside of where you live somewhere. And it's almost going to guarantee operating at far less of its capacity than it could. So then, okay, who's going to do that work? Well, everybody could, but everybody's really busy. And this is, well, there are probably going to be a fair number of people who aren't as busy as they used to be. And that we need to think about, how do we make it possible for them to participate in this? And there's, I think, multiple levels. And the first level, I'd say, is moving from the notion of volunteerism to the notion of kind of stipended stewardship. And so in our community, when we ran into this, by the way, working with an elementary school, and we were trying to support that elementary school in taking a relatively simple and not very productive landscape around it and designing a climate resilient campus for that elementary school. And that meant a lot more trees and a lot more shrubs and a lot more diversity of water catchment and things. And immediately what we ran into is a school district probably only has resources to support 2 of the 4 elements of a landscape. The first element is their play yards, so they have to support those. And the second is the turf, and maybe they can have, that. But in terms of the trees and the non-turf landscapes, they've got no capacity for that. So what they're likely to do is, in fact, this is what got us into this relationship with the school district, they're likely to take the least cost barrier, which might be spreading herbicides on things because they don't want the weeds there, right? We caught them doing that. They acknowledge that they shouldn't be doing that, but they were in a bind. They don't have the resources to actually manage these landscapes for those values. So we said, well, wait a minute. What if we could train and place people who could help take care of those aspects of your landscape? And so we work with local non-governmental organizations, a local organization called the Tree Trust, another one called EcoCycle. And we said, help us to train community stewards, and then we'll stipend them about $30 an hour for 10 to 15 hours a month to just come in and do that really basic work of mulching and watering and pruning and weeding. And then suddenly we put that out to the community, and we had way more applications than we had spaces that we could take. But the really cool thing is, for less than $50,000, we now have 7, in fact, 8 community land stewards out there taking care of parts of our landscapes. So we think that's a scalable model for mobilizing a lot of people. And also, as we were saying, sort of deprofessionalizing this land stewardship in our community. So that's one level. And then we could talk about the next level, which is, okay, there are people who should be making a living doing this too, right? Okay, well, in our community, one of the big risks is fire. And we need to figure out how we manage our landscapes to be both shady and cool and biodiverse, but also not burn up. So we worked as a city across many departments and with other specialists to come up with a wildfire resilient landscapes guide, which is now available, by the way. But we needed people who could implement it. So about 2 weeks ago, we launched our first training program for local small and minority contractors to train them in doing that kind of work. And now as a city, I'm actually, in fact, today I was working on the scope for a series of contracts that we want to put out to those new contractors who have now all been qualified, so that they can actually bid on these contracts to do that wildfire resilience work. So now we're starting to build that capacity of the paid sector to do this. So that's all great, and I think that's the direction we need to go, but I just want to make this point. If we don't, as a society, then decide that that's where we want to prioritize putting a lot of our collective resources, there won't be people who can actually then do this work. And so I think one of the fundamental assertions I would make is this shift to a regenerative stewardship of our living world won't happen unless we restructure and refocus the priorities of our economy. And that's a political process. I think a lot of us who got into this work to work with living systems don't really like politics, and that's fine. But we have to recognize that this is fundamentally a political process, and that until and unless we restructure the economy around this, we won't be able to achieve this at scale.
That's really.
Well, I'm afraid we have to end it there, but that's an excellent point. Harb, did you want to say something before we close?
I just wanted to say that that was a really eloquent and passionate, and at least to me, and I think many of our viewers, very convincing sort of set of facts that you presented and perspectives. So the question would be, to wrap up for our viewers, if they say, well, yes, I want to be more engaged in this, and it is a political process. Can you suggest any organizations that they could support, get involved in, the center that you've started, or other that your colleagues and others have around the country, or for that matter, around the world? Because our viewership is not restricted to the United States by any means.
Yeah, so I'll throw out a few. So on the larger sort of global scale, I'd invite people to look at the work of One Earth. They've got an amazing set of resources there and are doing some really useful analysis of where the funding is and isn't for this work. But their bioregional maps that you can access online are incredible and a great resource. For those who are interested in kind of at a national scale, especially in the urban nature-based solutions work, the Center for Regenerative Solutions, our website is naturebasedclimate.solutions. It has a lot of resources there that can help you, and we're going to be coming out with a lot more in the near term. We're about to do a state of the field report on urban nature-based solutions that will have a lot of resources there. And then finally, if you want to see what this looks like locally, I invite you to look at the work of Cool Boulder. It's literally just www.coolboulder.org. You can see our neighborhood nature labs, our community land stewards programs, the way that we're mobilizing 60 plus community organizations to work together on this work locally. And we'd love to hear from you about the work that you're doing wherever you are.
Thank you so much. I've been to Boulder a lot, and I look forward to my next visit to see some of those places in real life. And I will definitely remember your term stipended. I can't pronounce it, but stipended stewardship. I think that's a wonderful idea. And I'll add it to the next edition.
In your book, Herb. It goes in the next chapter.
That will be in the next edition of my book. And thank you so much, Brett. Keep up the good work. Stay in touch with us. To our viewers, take a look at the resources that we post. And the great thing about this is everybody can get involved, as you said. This is not some distant technology that unless you have the money or the technical sophistication, you can't access it. We all can, and we all must. Let me turn it over to you, Dale, to wrap it up.
Okay, well, I think that pretty well wrapped it up. So thank you both. This was a really interesting program. Really appreciate your participation today. And look forward to talking with you sometime in the future, hopefully.
Thank you, Dale.